There once was a revolutionary Jewish leader who marshaled a band of fishermen and peasants from the region of Galilee and marched on the city of Tiberias, where they set fire to the palace and burned the city to the ground. They plundered all the gold and furniture, then executed all the Greek people in the city and anyone who sympathized with them. That leader's name was Jesus. Jesus, son of Zaphas, Yeshua ben Zaphas in Hebrew. There was a poor Jewish farmer who came to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles and began to cry out, "A voice from the east, a voice from the west, a voice from the four winds, a voice against Jerusalem and the temple, a voice against the bridegroom and the bride, a voice against all the people. Woe to Jerusalem," he said. Day and night he went all about the alleyways with this cry on his lips. Some of the leading citizens were incensed at his words and arrested and chastised him. But without a word on his own behalf or for the private ear of those who beat him, he continued his cries as before, "Woe to Jerusalem." The magistrates believed he was under some kind of supernatural impulse and brought him before the Roman governor, who had him flogged to the bone. Yet he never shed a tear, but merely introduced the most mournful of variations into his utterances and responded with each lashing, "Woe to Jerusalem." When the Roman governor asked him who he was and why he uttered these cries, he would not answer them, but increasingly reiterated his dirge over the city until the governor pronounced him as a madman and released him. That prophet's name was Jesus, son of Ananias, Yeshua ben Ananias in Hebrew. This week, many Christians across the country will sing the words of a popular praise song. Jesus, faithful through the ages, all of my joys the greatest, the one and only Jesus. But there has always been more than one Jesus. He was not like Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, the first of her name. No, Jesus was not the first of his name at all. There were many people named Jesus. It was a very common name in first century Palestine, a Hellenized version of the Hebrew Joshua or Yeshua, which means the one who saves. And during a time of great messianic fervor, with people suffering under the weight of Roman occupation, longing for salvation and deliverance and liberation, a lot of people named their children for the thing they wanted most: Jesus, liberation, salvation. And so there were priests named Jesus, and scribes named Jesus, and fishermen named Jesus, and prophets named Jesus, and revolutionaries named Jesus. In fact, the historian Flavius Josephus mentions 20 different important leaders named Jesus in his historical account of the first century Jewish world. Jesus bar Ananias, Jesus bar Damnaeus, Jesus bar Gamaliel, Jesus bar Zaphas, Jesus bar Japhet, just to name a few. Bar meant son of. So it was Jesus bar this and Jesus bar that. And then, of course, there was Yeshua bar Mary and Joseph, Jesus of Nazareth. So there was never just one Jesus. There have always been many Jesuses. This is just as true today as it was in the first century. We have many Jesuses in our day too, do we not? We have Republican Jesus and Democrat Jesus, conservative Jesus and liberal Jesus, evangelical Jesus and mainline Jesus, southern Jesus and northern Jesus. We have American Jesus, which Stephen Prothero breaks down as the enlightened sage or the sweet savior or the manly redeemer or the superstar. We have white Jesus and capitalist Jesus and patriarchal Jesus and gun-toting Jesus and prosperity Jesus and purity Jesus and Zionist Jesus. We have homophobic and Islamophobic and xenophobic Jesus. We have the nice Jesus and the friendly Jesus, the sentimental Jesus, the laid-back, happy-go-lucky Jesus, the spineless Jesus. We have heavenly Jesus and mystical Jesus and hippie Jesus and righteous Jesus. We have billboard Jesus, dashboard Jesus, bumper sticker Jesus, business Jesus, influencer Jesus, and Hollywood Jesus. There's even a touchdown Jesus. Maybe there should be a March Madness Jesus, too. But the scariest Jesus of all is the Jesus we make in our own image. A Jesus who looks like us, and talks like us, thinks like us, acts like us, votes like us, lives like us. A compromised Jesus, complicit in 1,000 structures of prejudice and systems of oppression. An encumbered Jesus, beset by countless self-righteous, self-aggrandizing, and self-deluded machinations. Calvin said the human heart is a factory of idols. And we are experts at making Jesus into our own image and likeness when we're called to live in the likeness of Jesus and not the other way around. Now, there are many who contend that it is impossible for us to avoid making Jesus in our own image, but the Gospels resist this temptation at every turn. When Jesus is tried, we are tried. When Jesus is on trial, all of humanity is on trial as well, and all our ideas about God, ourselves, and the world are tried. In each of the four Gospels, the story of Jesus' trial is slightly different, a few nuances here and there, but in every single version, the same character always appears before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. He pops up as if almost out of nowhere, and his name is Barabbas, or should I say Jesus. Matthew preserves his full name, Jesus, son of Abbas, Yeshua bar Abbas, which means son of the Father. In the 2nd century, the early church scholar Origen said that all the early manuscripts of the Gospels had Jesus Barabbas' full name, the one who was released by Pilate, Jesus Barabbas. Yet over the centuries, translators took out the first name Jesus because they thought it was confusing people. Who was the real Jesus? Like a lot of things, the monks were right for the wrong reasons. Who is this man named Jesus Barabbas? Mark tells us that Jesus Barabbas was in prison with the other rebels who had committed murder during an insurrection, but we don't know which rebels or what insurrection or who they murdered. And this is the only time that Barabbas will appear in Scripture. Through deep study, however, scholars have identified that Jesus Barabbas was most likely a member of a secret society of zealots called the Sicarii, or dagger men, a highly trained group of Jewish assassins who engaged in political executions of leaders who were in collaboration with the Roman Empire. The Sicarii were known also, in addition to their assassinations, for stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, and then kidnapping people for ransom. The strategy was simple: threaten the security of the ruling class, destabilize the government, and incite a revolution or a full-blown war if possible. Their ultimate objective, of course, was to overthrow the Roman occupation and to restore the Jewish monarchy through violence. For some, Jesus Barabbas was a terrorist. But to many, Jesus Barabbas was a patriot, a freedom fighter. And Passover was all about freedom. The most important Jewish festival, commemorating the Hebrews' deliverance from slavery in Egypt, was a holiday dedicated to the celebration of freedom. And this is why so many Jewish revolts over the centuries against Roman occupation took place at Passover. And so, to prevent the people from revolting as they did so often, Pilate developed a custom of releasing a prisoner on Passover. It was a way of keeping people calm and appeasing the crowds who were gathered there, dreaming of freedom on the high holy days. But on this particular Passover, Pilate was in a sticky predicament, a catch-22. He was caught between the chief priests who were demanding the death of Jesus of Nazareth, who hadn't killed anyone, and the crowds who had just had a parade for him and were ready to revolt at any sign of Roman brutality. We're not privy to any of the behind-the-scenes conversations between Pilate and the chief priests on that Passover, but we have enough here to know the devious yet ingenious plan Pilate designed to resolve this conundrum. Pilate needed to maintain his relationship with the chief priests for economic reasons, but he didn't really need much from the crowd except for them not to revolt. He could crush them at any moment with a Roman legion, but didn't want to have to do that if he could avoid it. So he conjured a diabolical plot, a shrewd and nefarious political move that is as old as politics itself. He manipulated the crowd. He pulled at the emotions of the people, inciting their base desires, playing their nationalism and patriotism against itself, asking them, do you want a genuine Jewish revolutionary, or do you want this imposter? The Roman and Jewish establishments working perfectly together, maintaining their relationship of power by exploiting the crowd's religious fervor, their desire for true freedom, their lust for blood, by giving them a choice between two different Jesuses, two fundamentally opposing versions of revolution, two conflicting visions of freedom, two incompatible ways of life in the world. Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Barabbas? Which one should we pardon? Which one should we free? Which one should live? Which one will you follow? Which one is going to save you? 2,000 years later, it may be difficult for us to understand this choice. But last Easter, the New York Times opinion writer David French put it quite plainly. The spirit of Barabbas, he writes, is the desire to seize or retain power through violence if necessary. And it has been at war with the Spirit of Christ since the beginning. 2 millenniums of church history demonstrate a terrible truth. There was nothing uniquely evil about that ancient crowd. Instead, it held up a mirror to our own nature, one that is all too eager to wield the sword, to believe that power over others is a prerequisite to justice. The spirit of Barabbas was alive and well in the Southerners who trained their fire hoses on peaceful protesters, or who set their dogs on the black children of Birmingham. And the spirit of Barabbas, French writes, tempts Christians even today. He said, we see it when armed Christians idolize their guns, when angry Christians threaten and intimidate their political opponents, when fearful Christians adopt the tactics of Trumpism to preserve their power. The spirit of Barabbas, French writes, most clearly captured the mob on January 6th, when Americans praying to Jesus participated in an insurrection based on a lie. French says, Christ did not reject earthly rule, so his flawed followers could seize the world's thrones. But before we get all high and mighty as progressives, we must acknowledge that the spirit of Barabbas haunts the left as it does the right. Look at our gleeful support for sending more weapons to Ukraine, our refusal to condemn the violence of Hamas, our blind support for Israel's bombardment, our inability to call what's happening in Gaza a genocide, our willingness to continue to spend trillions more dollars on the Department of Defense and military weapons and police and prisons than we do on public education, housing, hunger, or health care. I myself am not immune to the spirit of Barabbas. There are days when I wake up and I read the newspaper and I find myself longing for Barabbas to come, longing for a messianic figure to come and lead a revolution, to overflow the corporate class in this country and establish a more just and equitable society. Have you ever longed for a Barabbas to come? You don't have to lie, you're in church. Yet every time I dream in that direction, I know I'm not longing for Jesus of Nazareth, but for Jesus Barabbas. There has always been more than one Jesus. The question is not if we follow Jesus, but which one. Every major force in Palestine was present in Jerusalem when Jesus came to town for Passover. The Romans were there. The chief priests and the Jewish authorities were there. The Pharisees and the Sadducees were there. The crowds and the popular masses were there. The Jewish revolutionaries and the Sicarii were there. The disciples were there. And every single group that was there rejected Jesus of Nazareth. The disciples betrayed, abandoned, and denied him. The crowds who had cried, "Hosanna," as he came in, shouted, "Crucify him," at his trial. And they all rejected him in favor of a violent, revolutionary nationalist. They chose the wrong Jesus, just as we so often do today. The Gospels show us that regardless of our social location, economic situation, or political affiliation, Jesus Barabbas is a very attractive option. The problem is that choosing to follow Jesus Barabbas changes nothing. It's just more of the same. Because the revolution that Jesus Barabbas was leading does not have the power to transform the world. He was just another momentary flash in a never-ending cycle of violence. As Dr. King once preached, the ultimate weakness of violence is that it is a descending spiral, besetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you may murder the liar, but you cannot murder the lie. Through violence, you can murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. In fact, returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness, he writes, cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. The Jesuses of history and the Jesus of our own making have no power to save us, deliver us, or liberate and transform our world. And yet we follow them. Why? Because we don't like what the real Jesus demands of us. So we crucify any Jesus that does not conform to our desires. We crucify any Jesus that challenges our way of life or our most deeply held beliefs. Any Jesus that calls us beyond the comfortable confines of our neatly manicured lives, we crucify. We crucify any Jesus that asks us to give up our wealth and possessions, any Jesus that makes true demands on our lives, any Jesus who requires that we give up our power or the lies that we're trapped in, any Jesus who expects us to change our ways or calls us to move beyond our convictions, we shout, "Crucify him. Crucify him." It turns out Jesus of Nazareth is far more dangerous than Jesus Barabbas. The chief priests knew it. Pilate knew it. And why? Because freeing Jesus Barabbas meant that everything would stay the same. But freeing Jesus would have meant that everything would have changed. Why? Pilate and the chief priests knew that the crowd was too punch drunk on freedom to understand is that Jesus Barabbas may look like the true revolutionary or the righteous one or the patriotic one or the heroic one or the one who can save us and deliver us and liberate us, but his path is the same as all the revolutionary Jesuses who came before and after him, forgotten in the annals of history, destined to be another speck on the timeline of humanity, because the empire will always destroy any revolution that is built on violence. The empire always has more firepower. But there is one revolution the empire is no match for, and that is a revolution built on love. Love is the only force in the universe more powerful than all the empires the world has ever seen. And love is the revolution that the Jesus of Nazareth came to bring. A love that challenges all that the empire has and changes absolutely everything. There has always been and always will be more than one Jesus. The question has never been if we will follow Jesus, but which one? Will we follow Jesus of Nazareth or Jesus Barabbas? Which Jesus will we choose? Which one will we pardon and which one will we condemn? Which one will we free and which one will we crucify? It's Palm Sunday, which means the time has come for us again to decide which Jesus will we follow and which Jesus will we reject. Which revolutionary and which revolution do we want? Which path toward freedom will we take? Which form of deliverance? Which kind of liberation? Which vision of the world? Which version of the future? Life is full of choices. Every day we wake up and make choices. We rise like Pilate and the chief priests and the crowd, and we make choices. But there are people in our world who don't have the choices that we make, who don't have the choices we have. People who are victims of the choices that we make. The poor, the oppressed, and the crucified people of history. And they are the ones also who are crying out like the crowds today, but crying out with a different message. Crying out to us today, asking us to choose Jesus of Nazareth over Jesus Barabbas, because their lives and their futures depend on which Jesus we choose to follow. So what will it be? You may be singing, "Give me Jesus" this week, but the crucified of people of history want to know which Jesus you're singing about. Is it "Give me Jesus of Nazareth" or "Give me Jesus Barabbas"? This is the choice on which all other choices depend. There has always been more than one Jesus. So choose this day which Jesus you will serve, which Jesus you will pardon, which Jesus you will free, which Jesus you will believe, which Jesus you will stake your life on, which Jesus you will follow. Do you choose life, love, and liberation? Or do you choose death? Amen.